Welcome to Grandma Magic, a podcast from the Grandmother Collective. We are a nonprofit organization that supports and advocates for a world where a grandmother's power is seen, cultivated, and activated for positive change. The Grandma Magic podcast is an opportunity to learn more about the unique positions that grandmothers, aunties, and other older women around the world can play in advancing positive social development by talking to and learning from grandmother changemakers. We hope this series inspires you, brings you joy, and helps you recognize the enduring magic and wisdom that comes from grandmothers everywhere. I'm Lindsay Farrell, and I'm your host. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Hendrica Okondo, a global advisor and researcher for women's rights, empowerment, and partnerships in Africa. With over 2 decades of experience, Hendrica has held influential roles such as gender protection and AAP advisor with the UN World Food Program in Niger, and gender and humanitarian consultant with UN OCHA. Her extensive work includes developing gender-responsive humanitarian actions, training staff on gender dimensions in humanitarian programming, and advising on gender and protection indicators. Hendrica has also been instrumental in integrating gender perspectives in various international programs and initiatives, such as the joint WFP, UNICEF, UNFPA program, Breaking Barriers for Girls' Education. Her dedication to gender equality and women's empowerment has made a significant impact on both national and international platforms. Today, we'll delve into Hendrica's inspiring journey and explore the powerful ways she has influenced change. Hi, Hendrica.
Hi, Lindsay. Oh, you've made me sound so wonderful.
One of the things I'm asking everyone is what is a tradition or ritual or, something in your family or in your community that you want to make sure that you pass down to the generations that are coming after you?
Yeah, I think for me, the tradition is family meetings around festive seasons like Christmas, Easter, because we're a very strongly Catholic family. Easter and also birthdays, people's birthdays. And what was so interesting when I was growing up was my grandmother. She always wanted to know what we were doing because she had 12 children, and each of her children, except one, had almost an average of 10 children. So there was 100 of us.
Oh my.
And my grandmother, because she got married very young and she was an orphan, so she really wanted a big family. And so she made sure that she knew what every grandchild was doing. And so for every family meeting, she would have everybody speak from the oldest to the youngest. And I was the oldest, I was the first grandchild. And my youngest cousin, I think by the time my grandmother died, I think my youngest cousin was like 2 years old. And my grandmother died when I was, I think, 36. So she would actually listen to everybody and she would ask you, like, what are you doing now? What's your 5 year plan? And it really used to irritate us. But I took that. And then my father was also very much like my grandmother. So he was very religious. So we used to say the rosary. And then he would ask us, what is your 5 year plan? Like every week. It was irritating. But I took this to our family and we do
Mm.
it. And at first, people were getting very irritated, but now they really think about
Mhm.
it and they know that, Aunt Hendrika is going to ask us about our 5 year plan. And now we're scattered. We're a very big family and we're scattered. Some people are in the US, some are in Germany, some are in Switzerland, and we have a WhatsApp group and we try to just get together once. And when people come into Nairobi, we then have a big family
Mm.
meeting. And so that's what I would like, I think, and my children are trying to kind of do that.
I know it's very hard. I'm imagining this family meeting took place up country.
No, because we're Nairobi based. I'm a fourth generation Nairobi person. My grandmother lived in Nairobi. She was born in the village, but she came to Nairobi when she was 12. with a husband that was almost 30 years older than her.
She was 12 when she got married?
Yeah, she was 12 when she got married because she was an orphan, and her sister, who was looking after her, was like, "You need to get out of the village." And so my grandfather had actually fought in the Second World War as part of the Kenya African Rifles. And so he was coming out of Burma, which is Myanmar now. And he goes to our village, which is an island in Lake Victoria. And my grandmother's sister's like, "You don't want to live like me because the women have to do all the work. They go through a lot of violence, and the men are fisher folk, so they go out fishing on other islands. And then they have wives in all those islands. And then when they come back to this island, sometimes they're very nice, sometimes they're not." And so my grandmother's sister was like, "You don't want to live here. You need to get out." And so there's this young man who's just come back from the war, and he's really smartly dressed. You should see the pictures of my grandfather. So my grandmother, who at 12 years old was very assertive, says, "Yes, I'll marry him, but I have to marry him in church."
Was that to make sure that she was the only wife?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was also one of her reasons, was like because polygamy was part of the culture. Because she's is going to church a lot, and she's just been baptized. And so she's like, "I have to marry him in church." And so he agrees. And then they come to Nairobi.
That was a very mature 12-year-old.
I mean, she was an old soul.
And so did he get land as a former soldier?
No, he was not. And most of them become faceless. They don't get recognized. And the ones who died are just put, it's called the British Army Cemetery. And there's just one memorial for the African soldiers that died. But they get given a house in Kariako. You know what Kariako meant?
Yeah, carrier corps.
Yeah, they were carrier corps, and that's what they had done. They had carried the luggage for the British soldiers. And so the only thing they got was those little houses. And so my grandmother lives in those little houses and has her 12 children in those little houses.
Wow, I know that those have been passed down and passed down by generation. And then some of the other old city council estates.
Yeah, but it was fun. I mean, growing up, we always wanted to go and live there because my grandmother, she was a brewer. She had learned to brew changa in the village.
Well, that's how you get people to come to the family meeting, right?
Yeah, of course. And of course, it has a very dark side effect in that most of the men in my mother's family were alcoholics. But they weren't violent because my grandmother was very, very strict. And also, both my grandmother and my grandfather were very religious. So my grandfather becomes the catechist at St. Peter Clever's.
The grandfather who was in the army.
Yeah. And that's really was a turning point for our family because then my mother herself is forced to get married at 17 because she's the second eldest of the 12. And she's very, very smart, but my grandfather pulls her out of school because he needs somebody to help him bring up the others. So he convinces my mother to marry his best friend, who's my father, who's like 20 years older than my mother. Then my mother and my father then bring up the rest of the family.
That's very tough to be one of those eldest in an African family, especially when you have school fees to pay and all of the things that come with raising children times 12.
Yeah, it was very difficult for my parents. And my father self educated himself. So he becomes an accountant and he becomes the chief auditor of the railways.
Well, that's a good position that comes with a pension and things like that, right? Mhm.
Yeah. And also, we get to live in those big houses in Westlands.
Which houses in Westlands? There was railway housing in Westland?
Yeah, the railway housing. They've all been grabbed, but they were built like British cottages
Like along Ring Road or
along Parklands Road into Westlands. It was called Ojijo Road. They've grabbed them and they've built all these Airbnb apartments. I mean, they were single family with a lot of land. And they had attic rooms. So we had a playroom in the attic. Nairobi in the 60s was fantastic. They delivered milk, bread, Elliot bread, newspapers, and the doctor came home.
I think there was garbage collection, right?
There was garbage collection, yeah. And there was double
Yeah,
deckers.
the buses. A friend of mine does research on the buses, on the colonial buses.
I mean, the 60s were just glorious times to be in Nairobi.
So, how did you land yourself? I mean, coming from obviously powerful women who also at the same time had to make decisions that were very difficult. How did you land yourself in women's rights and human rights work?
I think my grandmother and her daughters, my grandmother had six daughters. The daughters are the eldest. The sons come later. And so the women are very, very strong and they're very powerful. They make decisions for the family. My grandmother makes decisions. So she has these meetings where people have to say what they're going to do. And then everybody has to contribute to the family kitty. And then she's a member of the YWCA. So she goes to these meetings where they're taught to be little English women. And two of my aunts, one aunt is called Margaret, another one is called Princess Elizabeth, because it's around the time where the Queen becomes the Queen. So though the British are doing horrendous things in Kenya,
The same time as Mau Mau, right? It's the same time as the internment.
yeah, it's the same time as Mau Mau. So actually, my aunt that's called Margaret was born in 1952, which is the height of the crushing of the Mau Mau.
Well, they were even rounding up in Eastlands like Carriacou and other places.
Yeah, they were arresting people. So the area where my grandparents live is called Ziwani because most people are coming from the lake.
Oh, I get it. Okay, Ziwa Lake.
Yeah, Lake Victoria. So most people who lived there were Luos or Luyas from around the Lake Victoria. The women in those regions are very strong, very powerful. And so they actually get together because the colonial government decide they're going to tax the Changa brewers and they're going to demand a license. So they make it illegal. So the women go on strike and they revolt. And there's a lot of unrest. And then they kill one woman who becomes really famous. And I only learn about this later. I mean, they kill a lot of women, but one woman, Mary Nyanjui, her name comes up a lot because at that time they had arrested one of the Mau Mau leaders, and the men are scared. The men are not doing anything about it. So the women, because they're fighting the taxation, there's the hut tax. So the colonial government decides that everybody, all the Africans, have to pay a hut tax. Remember, they're not getting any services. They don't have access to education, they don't have access to health, and they have to pay tax. And then there's some sort of apartheid, and the men have to have a pass. The women don't exist.
To be able to live in the city or to work in the city.
To be able to live in the city,
That's why there's that road called Kipande Road, right? Which means pass. Kipande is a pass, which separates the city.
yeah. And as a woman, you can't live in the city unless you're married. And a lot of the women that come into the city have actually run away from polygamy. The ones from central Kenya have run away from FGM. They've run away from these ridiculous religious people that are calling polygamous marriages sinful and refuse to baptize them. But then the colonial government is saying you can't be in the city unless you have a husband.
Well, they didn't build housing for families.
Yeah, they didn't know because only men were supposed to be in the city.
That's why Carriacou, where your grandmother was one room.
One roomed houses because they were only supposed to be for laborers. Now, this one roomed house has become the house of 14 people.
I can't imagine that. You know, I did my research in Kibera, so I definitely know what it looks like to be very creative with a single space in a city.
Yeah, and how they brought the Nubian soldiers and just abandoned them in
Mhm.
Kibera. And it took them, I think, 50 years to be recognized as Kenyan citizens. The colonial history is horrible.
Horrible.
My father's very conscious about it because he's a trade unionist.
Mm.
And so, in some of those meetings that we used to have as a family, what was hilarious is we would listen to Julius Nyerere, who at that time really hated Kenya.
Oh, yeah.
So he used to have like a 4 hour mazungumzo baada ya habari where he,
So you would listen to the news, and Julius Nyerere would be there, and then you'd have a conversation for 4 hours.
yeah, but Nyerere would have a 4 hour
Oh, he would have a 4 hour talk.
insulting Kenya.
Well, he was very disappointed that Kenya was going down this pathway towards capitalism and individualism.
Kenya was the bastion of
Yeah.
capitalism. The rest of the Africans, up to now, still call us the colonial puppets, which we were. I mean, if I look at our life in the 60s and the 70s, we were definitely colonial puppets. We still are.
I mean, it's definitely a hard thing to move out of people's minds.
Yeah, and it was very bizarre for us. I mean, especially for my grandmother and her daughters, because they liked the lifestyle
Mhm.
of the English. They were being taught to make scones with cream and cucumber sandwiches. So we used to have this for the family meetings.
That's what you had it for your tea? Was a very British tea?
Yeah, because my grandmother's really good. She baked cakes when she wasn't brewing changa. And she had a little stall that sold cakes. And so we loved going to visit her. I mean, she was really the best grandmother ever. She was very smart, very well dressed. She went to church in a hat.
And at the same time, you're juxtaposing with a trade unionist father, listening to Nyerere, knowing women that had been protesting taxes.
Yeah, going to church and to a school that's run by Irish nuns. And the Irish are at the height of fighting the British colonial. So we're singing songs, Faith of our fathers, holy faith. I mean, we're praising the Irish who are fighting the British
While eating cucumber sandwiches.
and eating cucumber sandwiches and wearing little hats. I mean, I have pictures of my grandmother that are just absolutely hilarious.
So, Hendrika, what was it for you? I'm going to call you a little bit of a radical. Like, what radicalized you into taking this pathway?
I think what radicalized me was getting a scholarship to a convent school that had a lot of the children of the political elite. But then having a father that was a socialist and at one time a member of a communist party. So he's making us read Mao Zedong, the Red Book, but also praying the rosary and also listening to Nyerere. So I become conscious of the inequalities. I start to see the difference between like where my grandmother lived and where we live, and then the school that I'm going to, and then the political elite. And then in 1974, they killed J.M. Kariuki. And his daughter Rosemary was in our school. She was actually our classmate. So we now have this situation where we have Kenyatta's daughter in our school, and he's killed J.M. Kariuki. So we are praying for the soul of Rosemary's father. But we're also going to Kenyatta's to Gatundu to drink tea and have sandwiches. And of course, the nuns are completely hypocritical because they have to pay homage to the government, but they also have to take care of this little girl whose father's been murdered. And they're Irish nuns. So they're talking to us about the inequalities, about the social issues, about how it's wrong what the political class is doing. But when the Kenyattas come, like Mama Ngina was always coming to our school because her daughters went to the school, they're different. So to me, it was very confusing.
And this is high school for you? This is your secondary school.
This is high school. Yeah, it's high school. And then there's a nun that we all loved, Sister Pauline. So she actually gives us a book, which is Germaine Greer's book. It's one of the first feminist reading books. It's called The Body. And Germaine Greer is a feminist, and she writes about women being in charge of their bodies. And I think for me, that was a really powerful thing that when I read that. And then we have a Kenyan nun who you might know because she then leaves the nunnery and becomes Professor Wanjiko Kabira.
So she's one of your teachers.
Yeah, so she's one of our teachers. She's very radical. She's the first person that tells us that Kenyatta is not a hero because he writes a book that promotes FGM.
The ethnography he wrote about facing Mount Kenya.
Yeah, facing Mount Kenya, yeah. He was basically very misogynistic and actually writes a book that promotes FGM. And it's Wanjiko that unpacks that. But at that time, she's Sister Anne. So, anyway, she also writes a book of poems called The Pot is Broken. She kind of starts to make us more conscious of feminism. And that's how I leave school now, beginning to think about my mother and her mother and the fact that they were actually feminists. And the way they did it was to negotiate, I think, the different spaces. So they would follow the religion because that's where they access health and education, but they would also challenge the power structure. My grandmother, by ensuring that all her younger daughters go to school, so whereas my mom didn't finish school and my mom's eldest sister who was just a year older than her didn't finish school, the rest of my aunts all become professionals. They all go to school. And that's my grandmother's work. She sort of realizes how important it is to educate women and also for women to be in charge of their own bodies. Because by the time she has 12 children, I think she's 25 years old. And she then decides, I'm not having any more children. Although she's Catholic, she's been indoctrinated in the Catholic faith, she actually goes to a women's group that is doing family planning. And she actually becomes one of the distributors of the family planning pills and also becomes very active in the Marie Stop Club. At one point, I was very Catholic too because that's how I was brought up. And when I asked her, she said, well, the Pope doesn't have an unfaithful husband. He doesn't have to get pregnant every year. So he has no business making decisions for me and my body.
That is so radical.
And this is a woman that did not go to school, doesn't have formal education, but she's able to understand that I am responsible for my own reproductive health decisions.
Can you imagine? I mean, I don't think you have 12 children, right, Hendrika?
No, I have four.
Yeah. Can you imagine 12 times?
I would have died.
I mean,
Yeah.
even 4 sounds like crazy to me.
Oh, yeah, four is crazy. My mother thought I was crazy. My
Yeah.
mother had nine.
Oh my god.
She was coming to me and saying, what the heck are you doing? You went to school so you'd focus on yourself. What are you doing?
Well,
But at that point, I had become like my grandmother. I decided I'm going to understand this church. I'm going to be part of this church. I became the chair of the parish. I was going to engage with this religion. It is my religion.
so
And
where did you go to school? You went to university.
yeah, I went to school, Loreto Convent, Musangari.
That was for secondary. And then did you go on to university?
I went to Nairobi University,
And what did you major in? Or what was your course?
agriculture.
Agriculture.
Yes. And guess who taught me animal anatomy?
I don't know who.
Professor Wangare Maathai.
Oh my goodness.
And remember, she's also a convent girl. So we connected a lot. I volunteered for the Green Belt movement.
Okay.
I trained the women. I went tree planting. I did a lot of work with her.
You have some real bona fides of people who were there to influence.
Yeah, I stand on the shoulder of really great women,
Yeah.
really great women. It was very powerful working with her, extremely powerful. I mean, just how you can use the tree to empower women. Because one thing we realized, especially in Western Kenya, women weren't allowed to plant trees.
What?
Yeah, because that would give you ownership to land.
There was something in Luo culture that if you planted a tree, is it anything or just trees?
Trees, and particularly certain type of trees. So with her, we did a lot of research and we came up with a tree that wasn't a threat, but that could provide firewood.
Yeah. Grow quickly.
Grevillea was not a threat because it doesn't last very long. and it provides firewood, it provides foliage for ripening the bananas,
Mm.
shade, and it's also used for building because termites don't like it. It has a bitter taste. And so the women were allowed to plant grevillea, but they weren't allowed to plant anything like the oak tree or bigger trees.
Something that could last 100 years or 200 years.
Yeah, because that would give them a right to the land. Can you imagine?
What I love is the subversiveness of it. What would have been better is to get women to be able to like overcome that and plant oak trees and own land, but it was a slow moving process. The end goal being that women were still empowered and trees were still planted and the environment was still protected.
And they also had the sources of income because if they had that tree, they could sell the firewood.
If you put the tree in the ground, they would treat it sort of more like planting corn or planting bananas.
Yeah, it was like an income generating
Ah,
thing. If you're driving from Kisumu all the way to Budalangi, where I am married, you see a lot of grevillea trees
that we're all part of that.
that were all planted by the support of the Green Belt movement.
Wow.
And this gave women income, and that was income that they controlled because they controlled the firewood market that was theirs, the bananas, that's their responsibility. So they were able to get money to pay school fees for their children without threatening the men ownership of land. So it was a very powerful project. And I think it's still there. I think it's now funded by the forestry department, but nobody actually knows how it started.
I've heard so much over the years, but I did not know this little tidbit about how to navigate. This story that you're telling is so much about how women know how to navigate power and like to be able to sit within two structures or within three structures in order to have their power, right? Like not recognizing to be in the church, but also recognizing that there's challenges to be made. And that's maybe just how women lead, right? We know that.
Yeah, actually, when I started to do gender, I realized that you need to unpack power.
Mhm.
And women are very good at that, and they don't have to be educated.
No.
They very quickly understand where the sources of power are. And I think that's what my grandmother and her daughters did. They understood where the sources of power was. And I remember then I go to Nairobi University, and it's at the most radical time because I'm in university from 1976 to 79. And that's really a radical time. Professor Wangare is running for National Council of Women's, and she's mobilized all her students. She gets vilified for being a divorcee, and the church, of course, goes against her, and she's Catholic.
Yeah.
And the church goes against her, and they're like, she's a divorcee, she can't lead women. And so I think we go to court, of course, we lose. But then a lot of us decide, okay, we're going to join the Catholic Women's Association, which it was that I did. And then you find that actually, okay, we've been vilifying the Catholic Church a lot, but the Catholic Women's Association is actually doing a lot of powerful things because they're promoting education for girls.
Mhm.
They're pushing healthcare. Okay, they're talking about they don't want family planning, but they're also talking about spacing of children
Mhm.
and using the beads to follow your cycle. And where that works for women like me, who at that point are privileged because I'm educated, I have a good job, I have a husband that understands that, okay, this is my ovulation time, so we're not going to do anything here. But for the women in the rural areas and for the women in the low income areas like Kibera, that's not an option. Because if he's coming back drunk and you're pulling out your beads, he's gonna beat you to death. So the women, they're coming to church, they're praying, but they're making their own decisions. And they're going to the Marie Stop clinic and they're getting their 5-year injections because that's their reality. And that's how I then start to rethink. I mean, I'm still very religious and I'm still following the rules, but I'm talking to my grandmother and my mom, and they're like, that is utopia. That's a bunch of men sitting and deciding what women's lives should be. But this is the reality of women. Things are getting worse. Men now don't have jobs, they're taking to alcohol. I remember there was a period towards the end of the 70s where the wives that had been left in the village are now coming to the city. And that was very dramatic because they're coming and finding the men have city wives. And so they're beating the city wives.
Oh, yeah. I feel like there's so many, what did they call it? Those grocery store novels? I can remember, like, reading these, like, really dramatic stories that everybody was writing at that time.
We actually lived that drama, especially in the railway housing, because a lot of the men were married women in the city, but they had left women in the villages. And as life gets harder, they stop sending money to the village.
Well, and in the '80s, you also had the Otieno, Wambui Otieno, like,
Well, yeah, the Wambui Otieno saga, yeah.
so it was like a real time of reckoning of being a modern woman in Kenya. What did that mean?
There's a young woman who's written a book. Her name is Deborah Auko Tendo. And that book should be made into a movie, honestly. Her father ends up with five wives.
And the 5 wives don't know about each other?
He has two wives in the village.
Oh,
The book is called Rough Silk.
okay.
And the two wives in the village discover that he has three wives in the city and they come to the city and there's total chaos. I read her book. I know that that happened to a lot of my playmates when I
Yeah.
was growing up. I mean, luckily for us, my father didn't have no wife in the village. And he was a very good husband, though he was an alcoholic. But for other families, it was very dramatic
Wow.
because towards the end of the 70s, things are getting rough.
Yeah.
The men are not sending money home. So the women come to the city and they fight these other women. And some of the fights were tragic. I mean, there'd be murders and what. It was terrible.
Mm.
So people get unhappy, you know. And then I'm at university and we're starting to realize that's when they coined this Wabenzi.
Of Mercedes Benzes.
Yeah, the political elites, they start buying Mercedes Benzes. There's so much
There's so
corruption.
much corruption.
Yeah, and the universities are fighting back. But we start to become very radicalized. But I'm still trying to navigate both worlds. I'm a
Yeah.
professional. I did agriculture. And then I get posted to the rural station in the middle of Homa Bay.
So you had a civil service job.
Yeah, I had a civil service job. Actually, my first posting was to Malindi. And I don't even know why I decided to go there. You know, at that time, you could choose where to go. So I go to Malindi, and my first boss is a crook. He's running this glass boat.
Yeah. The tourist road?
Yeah, but he has his own receipts. So the money is not going to the government. So in my little 24-year-old mind and my self-consciousness, I decide, let me write to headquarters.
Oh my goodness.
And of course, he's not running this scheme on his own.
So they
so,
just
I,
moved you rather than dealt with it?
so they moved me to
Yeah.
Homa Bay.
They were like, "Let's send her to her people, not have her be amongst a different group of people."
Which was horrible because there was no housing. And we were talking about it the other day because I did a consultancy in Haiti. I've just come back from Haiti.
Mm.
And so I was interviewing the different agencies and saying, why are you not recruiting women? And they're like, all the women who are educated have left.
They've left the country.
Yeah, they've left the country. And then it came back to me that it was very difficult for women to be in those rural stations. Because, first of all, there's no housing. Because the assumption is it'll be a man who has left his wife in the city. Then there's no protection because you're living next to your office. So people think they can come and complain about whatever it is they want to complain at your house in the evening. And I'm 25 years old. The farmers are the age of my parents.
Right.
And of course, the staff are stealing the fertilizer. They are doing everything they can do to make themselves as rich as their bosses. So it was not a very nice time.
Hendrica, I wonder, what are you most proud of when you look back?
If I look at what I did at that time was to identify the fact that we were training the wrong people in the farmer training centers.
Mm,
We were training the men, but the farmers were actually the women.
right.
And when I would go out to actually ask questions, the men didn't know anything and they never gave the information we were giving them to the women. So I'm proud of changing that and saying, let's not do the training at the farmer training schools. Let's go to the community. And so I started it, but it became part of it. So hold barazas
Yeah, community meetings.
with the chief and talk about the farming. The farmers already know. The other thing is, as agriculturalists, we don't know the reality of people. We don't know the rain patterns.
Right.
We don't know what crop is best to plant at what time, but the farmers do. And so for me, I was very proud that we actually moved from the isolation of being in a farmers training center and went to the people.
And do you think that they weren't sending women there because it seemed too official or that it's something that a man put his suit on to go to?
They didn't invite the women, number one.
They weren't even invited. Okay. Yeah.
They didn't think of them as farmers. Number two, the women couldn't leave because they are the ones who actually take care of everything. They have children, they have, the cow. We are doing zero grazing. Who's going to get the pasture to the cow? They take care of the chickens. They cannot leave. And these trainings used to be like 3 weeks.
Oh, like literally people taking public transportation and staying there for a while.
And then there was allowances that were paid. Which man is going to allow any woman to be paid allowance?
And that money didn't make it back to the family.
No.
But it's those small things that have laid the foundation for you. I mean, it's not a small thing, actually. It's a big thing, but
It's a powerful thing. I think it's a very powerful thing. And I later on really do get involved in sort of looking at women as farmers, as having knowledge, as having expertise. And that has stayed in my conscience. Even when I went to Haiti, I was like, I want to speak with the women. Can I
mhm.
go to a farming community? Can I talk to the women? How has the crisis impacted them? So that consciousness I get at that time, because I'm a city girl. I grew up in the city. And the city at that time was very safe. Nairobi had a bus that went round the city 24 hours. You could go to a disco in Westlands and be able to go home in Eastlands at whatever time. It was a
Mm.
very safe city.
Drika, as you think about that consciousness of always wanting to look for the women's knowledge, at the Grandmother Collective, we're always thinking about what is being unrecognized, what's being hidden by not centering older women or women's wisdom. Do you think it's changed or is there still quite a fight here?
I think it has, there's still a very big fight because the decision makers are still men
Yeah.
and they're still protecting their power. So for me, I recognize this per season. So as an agricultural officer and a researcher at community level, I realize that we're not recognizing the knowledge of women.
Mhm.
We're not acknowledging they have expertise. We are not acknowledging that they are the custodians of the seeds, of the local seeds, the local crops that they grow, the food crops. We are not recognizing that they understand the patterns. Because those women would tell me this season we are not planting beans because it doesn't rain long enough. That's knowledge that we need, that nobody's talking to them. And then, even in terms of nutrition, they know what the nutritious foods are, they have that knowledge. So that season, I acknowledge for me as a city girl, I didn't have that knowledge that the women in the rural areas had. And I always tell them, even when I talk to them, they say, "Oh, Mama, you're very educated." I'm like, "No, You actually have more information and more expertise than I do. So I really want to listen to you and hear how do you navigate this. And then after that, I then left and I went to the UK and did my master's degree. And I did agriculture and public health. And the reason I did that was because, and they still use that in Kenya, they were using DDT, which has been banned everywhere. And that was having impact on the lives of women, especially in the coffee and the sugar cane zones. So I decided, let me do public health. I did my master's and then I came back and I went to the university and I was a tutorial fellow, which is like the British have that. Instead of an assistant lecturer, they call them tutorial fellows. And so I started to do my PhD, but it was now getting dangerous because I'm in Egerton, I'm in Nakuru. It's the 80s, it's becoming very dangerous. Then the coup happens. And my father's like, you can't be out there, it's dangerous. I relocate to Nairobi. And I had met my husband in London. So he comes back and we get married. And of course, now I can't do my rural jobs because now I'm married. So that's how I end up in 1985. I present a paper at the Nairobi Forward Looking Strategies. You remember when they did the women's conference in Nairobi? So I participated in that meeting and I presented a paper on women in agriculture. And I actually talk about this whole business of women not being allowed to plant trees in Western Kenya. And the head of the British High Commission was there, and it was a woman. She actually comes to me and said, "You want a job?" So I get a job. I get recruited to work for the British High Commission. I mean, this woman, she was amazing, Dr. Mona Nance. She was amazing. She was like, we're going to sort this out. She was determined to sort out everything.
Did they have like a women's or a gender? I mean, I wouldn't probably have called it gender then, but women's section or what was the work?
No, her work was development aid, but she starts a program on gender. And so what we do is we set up what we're calling the gender learning networks. So we have like women in education. What are the issues? What are the gender issues in education?
Mm.
Then women in governance. What are the gender issues? So if you talk to a lot of the older politicians in Kenya, they know me because I funded a lot of them. So we have women in governance, we have women in academia.
This was DFID before it was DFID.
Yeah, it was before DFID, it was called ODA.
Overseas Development Agency or
It
assistance.
was
Yeah.
overseas development something.
Assistance, I
But
think. Yeah.
yeah. And then she leaves, but she gives a lot of money to the British Council to
Mhm.
continue the work. Actually, the reason she resigned was she did a study of the department. She calls a friend of hers from Sussex who does a study of the department.
Mhm.
And there's so many intersectionalities. There's racism, there's misogyny, there's wastage of resources. They're giving funding depending on the British political whatever.
Whoever's in power and
Yeah,
yeah.
whoever is in power. We're sending all the corrupt ministers to the UK for meetings, which we shouldn't be. And
Mm.
she's very conscious about it. And she starts to question it. So I think she falls out with the people in East Kilbride, which was the headquarters. And she resigns, but she gives resources to the British Council. So I go to the British Council and we continue the work.
Mm.
So a lot of the women who are vice chancellors or who are senior in the university, we gave them scholarships. And we insisted they get scholarships with funding for their nannies so they could take their children. Because what we did is we did the analysis on who was getting scholarships. There was hardly any women. And that was a fun time because we would go to the universities and say, show us the women. And of course, they would try to fight it because basically the men were giving these scholarships in the bar. And of course, the women cannot go to the bars.
Oh man, I want to tell you this, Hendrika. So I started going to Kenya in 2002, and I learned very quickly, first off, as a white woman, that I could go to the bar. And then I also learned how much was happening. That like if you weren't at the table at the bar, that you weren't getting anywhere.
There's a Canadian friend of mine, we're still very good friends. And she actually became my boss at World Food Program. And she used to say, "This is white woman country." Because she actually came in as a tourist to visit her boyfriend who actually cheated on her.
Oh.
So she kind of left him. Yeah, she left him.
Okay.
But she got herself a job and she ended up doing very well.
Well, you can do a lot as a white woman in Kenya.
You have access to a lot of power.
It's a very strange experience, actually. It just actually proves the intersectionality of things, that race and class and gender are intersecting in such ways that people don't really even see it. They wouldn't even know why they were accepting me to sit at a bar in a rural town when no other women are there.
Yeah, because for you, you represent power and they don't see you as a threat. They see you as a ladder for them to access power. And if you look at the history of Kenya and look at some of the leaders, even Kenyatta, they all had white wives.
Yeah.
Right now, it's Kikuyu wives.
Oh, that's the ladder to power?
Yeah, the power has shifted.
Mm.
So you find that a lot of the people in power now will have Kikuyu wives.
Well, I have one final question. As you sort of think about what's next for you. You're a grandmother now, right? You said you love being a grandmother. Where do you want to be putting your energy today?
I think I've gone, like I said, full circle to where my grandmother was, where she was encouraging young women to think about their lives and plan their lives. So, because I'm a grandmother, it gives me privilege to actually talk to younger women. And I have a program in the community that I run with young women. And because I have a lot of experience, but I also recognize that they can teach me a lot.
Mhm.
I'm able to go back to the village and talk to the young women there and say, there is hope. You can negotiate this, and this is how you can negotiate it. So at the moment, I have a program in Budalangi where we are training young teenage mothers as solar engineers. And I picked that when I was working in Tanzania. So I worked with women who were doing that. But what is for me, what is powerful is that these girls have had to fight the mother in laws who think they are useless because they got pregnant as teenagers, the husbands who are border riders and think they shouldn't be doing this training, their own families who think, why are you not having another child? But they're an amazing group of young women and now they are on their second level training and next week we are taking them to Kisumu for the certification as solar panel installers. So that to me is very powerful. And then, of course, my daughters who are feminists like me. So my daughters just had a son, and I love the little boy. So I spend time with him a lot, but I've got to do my work. So we talk a lot. He's just one, so he doesn't say much, but we wave at each other. And to me, I think what I realized when I went to Haiti was we're still not recognizing women, we're still not including their knowledge, and especially older women. So I'm kind of privileged because of my networks. I get these assignments. But there's a lot of other older women that have retired, that have information, that have skills. So I'm excited about the work that you do, Lindsay, in terms of the Grandmother Collective. And to meet Ruth Ochieng, because she's one of my heroines, really, she's a hero. She comes from the same clan as my grandmother, so I always call her my grandmother. And so you have women like Ruth who have so much information. You have Telma Awori also working out in Uganda, lots of information. So for me, it's like full circle. I still have these women I admire who are about my age and who I'm working with, but I also have the women in the rural areas who I know, even though they didn't go to school, they can be as impactful as my grandmother was.
It's just like a continued learning from older women. It's like a never ending.
Yeah, so when I work with those young women, I bring the older women to just talk. And at first, they cry a lot because of the missed opportunities. And then we push them to
Mm.
think more positively. So, okay, you missed to go to school, you didn't do this, but what did you do with your children? And the stories are so powerful.
It's a healing for everyone. It's a healing for the community if you can get all those women together.
Yeah, and I learned to do this when I was working for I end up working for the YWCA and I become the director for Africa.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even have that.
I spent 10 years as the director for Africa.
Hendrika, your story is just amazing. You're talking about other women having stories to tell, but you have many, many more. We may have to do a part 2 with you. Hendrika, it's been so wonderful to chat with you today. Thank you so much for your candidness and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.